Come on up, guys. I think, how many times do you have to be introduced, right? This is Omar.
Hello.
This is Paul. This is Larry. You have that down? And gentlemen, I don't know if you noticed, but there's a distinct discrepancy between the audience and us. They have wine. We do not. So we're going to
I thought
somehow...
you were going to make a diversity comment or something.
There are. Yeah. And if any of you want to come join us, we're happy to have you. I spent the weekend reading this book. It's a fascinating read. I would encourage all of you to do the same. Congratulations to Public Affairs, which had the wisdom to publish it. But it's about the pivot to the future and how technology is driving profound change in business and the complications and the pitfalls and the opportunities of taking advantage of it. But Omar, maybe you can give us like a 30-second description.
30-second description. Okay, so leading companies figure out that disruption comes from innovation, and therefore you need to take innovation extremely seriously as a long-term endeavor with continuous pivots in your business to keep evolving and changing. And the book basically is a modern-day playbook on how to do that.
So where I'd like to start, because you talk early in the book about what you call trapped value, that we've all kind of reached the point, and I think most people in business, we do surveys at Fortune that pick this up, most people in business understand that there's a set of technologies out there that is going to profoundly change almost everything they do. AI in particular, the ability to put low-cost sensors on everything, collect data, and then turn that data into intelligence, but also things like 3D printing and so forth. And so there's a profound recognition that the next decade or 2 decades are going to see enormous change in business. And yet the actual change that we have seen to date is pretty small. So there's a big gap between the potential and the reality. Why is that?
Well, you're right. So the pace of technology-driven innovation is accelerating. It'll never again be as slow as it is now. And so the potential value creation is always going further away from the actual value creation of people applying technology today. And when you ask why is that, some of that's leadership mindsets, it's culture of corporations. Big companies, most of which were built in the 20th century, were optimized to perfection for efficiently executing in the 20th century way of doing things. As these new innovations come on, it takes a huge effort reskilling the workforce to completely change how you do things to take advantage of it. So essentially we're glued to the past.
Yeah, I want to stick with that for a minute because you had a really interesting sentence early in the book. You said companies are optimized for predictable performance. That's the 20th century company you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about all big corporations today, they were built around what business schools would tell you is Michael Porter's value chain model. So you've got your logistics functions, your manufacturing functions, your marketing, your sales, your service. And all these silos were built to perfection where the leaders of those units grew up learning how to optimize efficiency out of that mix. And
that was Six Sigma, that was GE, that was what everybody was doing in the 20th century.
And of course, continual improvement, Lean, Six Sigma, those are all very valid and important. But if you take only a cost reduction view of the world, you can't lead your way to greatness. And in a world where there's an incredible amount of trapped value out there in the supply chain, in the wider market with consumers, if you don't figure out how to harness that, someone else will. Someone else will figure out how to take that innovation and do what your customers need better, faster, cheaper than you are. And that's the problem.
Paul, there was a point in the early part of the book where I'm reading through it and I felt like, wow, everything I learned in business school is wrong.
And you know why that is? Because it is. It is wrong. And that's
I'll tell you, it was very expensive.
Yeah, no, then I always say we're not giving refunds either, sorry. But we will tell you, we will teach you some of the new insights so that, all of that wisdom was created in the context that Omar talked about. And it turns out if the context changes, the rules of the game have to change. And particularly if the speed and pace of technology innovation changes, a couple of the old rules, if a business is mature and commoditized, we said get rid of it, it's exit, it's never gonna see a profit again. But today what we're seeing is with the reinvention potential of innovation, we can give longer life to those businesses, excuse me, and they can actually create the fuel for growth. I'll give you just one more rule that I love, that, a fake rule, the old rules: milk the cash cow. How many people have heard of milk the cash cow? Yeah, of course. We're all supposed to, work the cash cow. And you know how terrible that is, because what it says is don't put any money in innovation. Don't give any of it back. Just let the profits roll. But what we find is that's predicated on slow technology. That means if technology isn't going to change the way business is done, it's not going to bring in new competitors, you can do that. That was the old days. Today, businesses change too fast. And I'll give you one quick example. Google. If you think about search engines, what we found in the research is that search engines is actually a tremendously competitive business still. There's no milking the cash cow for Google. They're making hundreds of millions of dollars of investment to compete against the Bing and others, and where some of the others, have failed in the past. So we're not milking cash cows. We're moving ahead.
And it's not just everything you learned in business school is wrong, but it's also everything the Wall Street analysts tell you is wrong.
Well, yeah, that's a great point. It's not everything the Wall Street analysts say, because they're going to try and create the value that they want to see. But oftentimes we've started to do some specific messages about this, which is that they're thinking about the value of a company in the wrong way. So one of the things we just looked at, which was fun, was future growth value, which is basically outside the current profits, what's left of the company is the stuff that's going to come from future profit growth. But if you're thinking about that from a cash cow, from this company's going to exit these businesses ways, you're going to have a very different idea of where that. So how you do valuation changes.
And also the notion of predictable earnings growth and all of those things that were hallmarks of companies like GE at the turn of the century are not what, in view of this book, are not what you're looking for.
Right, exactly, because you have to, again, be able to see the fuel for growth. So it says, are we going to be getting a stream of revenues? Are we going to be getting, profits and earnings from businesses that might have otherwise been sold off? Are we going to be getting more, and particularly having enough to invest to scale as well, which is the third crux of it. It's not just getting into the new, it's actually getting into the new with success, scaling quickly to profit.
All right, let's go there. Paul, you talked about what doesn't work and all the things we learned that are no longer applicable. But Larry, you really dug deep into the research to find out what does work. What are the tactics that allow you to pivot to the future? Can you talk about those?
Sure. So, obviously, a big part of it starts with being technology driven, what we call being technology propelled. If the technology is changing your business and changing your industry and changing consumer behaviors and indeed changing society as a whole, then you've got to embrace that. And that embrace has to start not just with your chief technology officer, it has to go all the way to the top. And the companies that we looked at that were most successful in embracing these new strategies, it was always led by the senior management of the company. They weren't necessarily the ones doing the wiring, but they were always the biggest cheerleaders of them. And one great example of that from the book we talked about that actually embraced almost all of these 7 different strategies we looked at is the Chinese appliance company Haier, which went from being a sort of failed government-owned factory in provincial China in the 1980s. It's now the world's largest manufacturer of white goods. And they have just been relentless in sort of changing the management style and embracing whatever new technologies come along. They now think of themselves as a software company, not a white goods company.
Which is fascinating to think about, and they, by the way, now own GE's appliance business.
Among others, yes.
I've interviewed John Riemann, fascinating guy, but you tell a really interesting story about how he started there and how he sent the message to the staff that the old days are over and there's a new day ahead. Can you talk about that?
So it's just a little background. He had no business experience whatsoever. He was a mid-level Communist Party official. They couldn't find anybody to be the general manager of this factory. They kept going. So finally he just said, I'll do it. And one of the first days he was there, some customers came in and said, we just bought this brand new refrigerator, which in the 1980s in China was a very major purchase, and it's broken. It was delivered broken. And so he went out with these customers to the inventory and to what was already made, and they looked and they realized about a quarter of all the finished goods inventory was defective. It was broken. And he said, I'm not putting up with this, and he had them take all the broken refrigerators into this courtyard in the middle of the factory, and he took a sledgehammer and personally destroyed every one of them. And he said, that's not us anymore. We're now going to be quality. Even though we could sell these defective, there was such a lead time for getting that kind of appliance, they could have sold the defective ones. He said, I'm not doing that.
You also talk about the importance of data and being data driven in this new model. Can you elaborate?
Sure, and of course this is in some ways the most dangerous of the strategies, because as we've seen, if you're collecting a lot of data, if you're not using it properly, if you're not respecting what your consumers or users want to do with it, if you're not sharing the value. Of course, another big problem with trapped value is it's very counterintuitive. You have to give back more of that value than you keep for yourself when you unlock it.
Which again was a no-no in the 20th century.
Absolutely.
You kept your data, and you kept all your...
But it's become so valuable, and already with analytics and big data, and as we're moving into the Internet of Things and blockchain and all the technologies that are going to rely on happy users willingly sharing the data, about being transparent about what you're collecting, what you're going to do with it, and then sharing the value with them that you're going to deliver from it. Otherwise, it's just not going to work.
One more of the principles that you talk about for making this change. You talk about the importance of being inclusive. Can you describe what you mean by that?
Sure. I mean, it's literally what people mean by it. We're now a global economy in every sense of the word. We have new sort of generations of workers who have very different sets of values and very different concerns. This idea that companies should have social values, social responsibility, relatively new, although some companies have had it all along, but now it's a way in which they're actually being measured and evaluated by Wall Street. This is actually more of an Accenture question, because they've really embraced this to a remarkable extent, as we tell in the book.
Only not in this panel, but elsewhere, diversity and inclusion becomes incredibly important.
He's bald. Sorry.
And he's not alone.
That's true.
Omar, we should talk about the Accenture Pivot, though, because you really led that. You were head of strategy. You lived it. Can you talk a little bit about?
It was very personal to me, but obviously with the team, and specifically with our late chairman and CEO, Pierre Nanterre, who this book is in many ways a tribute to.
He wrote the foreword,
He wrote the preface, exactly.
He wrote it shortly before he died, I assume.
December. Yeah, absolutely. So if you go back to 2013, 2014, Pierre had outlined an ambition 2020 for what he wanted Accenture to be. But the reality was at the time, as acknowledged by him, as we were not there, that this ambition that we would be a leading professional services player. And in actual fact, Accenture was being squeezed by what we call compressive disruption in this book, with a meaningful commoditization of a range of our services, from perfectly good quality players, but at just lower price points.
You're basically talking about like the Indian outsourcing services.
For example, with Indian outsourcing companies. And also with a meaningful risk of substitution of some of our services, where people were writing code to replace some of the professional services that our people did. And so and in fact, we had a couple of wobbly quarters back in 2014. Like I said, this became very personal to me, where around that time, Pierre asked me to come and take on the Chief Strategy Officer role and work with the management team on rethinking Accenture's approach. And so we pulled a whole range of levers. In the book, we talk about, to pull off the wise pivot that Paul described here, actually you need to make 3 pivots, one around innovation, one around your financial capital allocation, and one around your people. And indeed, that's what we did. And so under the covers of what we did with Accenture, we had to rethink our services and what we were bringing to the market. We called them the new set of services that we created. We had to rethink the business architecture, how we organize and operate the company in order to deliver those services, recognizing that they were very different from what we had yesterday. And we had to fundamentally alter our investment trajectory. And that involved taking a lot of money essentially out of what people would have perceived as the core business and putting it in new business areas, but while reinvesting in the core business to not milk the cash cow that Paul talked about. So, like I said, under the covers are a lot of other changes, but those were the big ones.
You acquired, 100 companies over the course of the last 5 years?
100 companies over 5 to 6.
And that's money that's going away from other pet projects and people already in the firm. That's not an easy thing to do.
It wasn't easy. I mean, although I would say, Accenture has a very healthy balance sheet. So like investing our capital was not in of itself the huge issue. The issue is how do you do it well? How does a big company buy a lot of small companies and not kill the culture, not run the amazing entrepreneurial
You
founders?
must
out
have killed
of-
a
out
couple
the-
of cultures out of 100.
Some of them went wrong. Yeah, absolutely. We had we had some misfires, the reality is what had made us hesitant to make acquisitions before was, of course, the previous very poor experiences, which were small in number. But of course, if you don't practice, you don't get good. And so we took a view that said, no, we're going to learn from the mistakes of the past and get it right. So we fundamentally went in and changed how we integrate a company, how we get the founders on board. We figured out what we felt were the real critical success factors of what would make a deal succeed. And at the heart of that basically is that the founders share your vision. That's not much more complicated.
Yeah, no, and there are a bunch of really interesting talent questions that are embedded in that we're going to get to in a minute when we get Ariana. Where is Ariana?
She'll be with
She's
us.
lurking in the back, listening though, I'm sure. Okay, good. You, Paul.
Now, I was just going to amplify something that Omar said because it was really fun for me as part of the team to watch. I will compliment Omar. It took some courage. It took tremendous courage to use asset reallocation as part of strategy. All of strategy, really. This textbook is true. It's about resource allocation. If you don't reallocate resources, you're not really implementing a strategy. And it took a lot, and as Omar said, in the last 3 chapters of the book, we talk about innovation, financial structures, and people. But the ways, it was great for me to watch Omar and the team.
It's easier to tell people how to do it if you've done it yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's probably actually something that people will enjoy reading in the book, is like how you made those.
Well, one of the reasons we wrote the book actually was the incredible resonance we had from client CEOs. I mean, I'm out talking to CEOs every week, and the story always lands. They always relate to it. And you're right, we are more credible because we are a public listed company that has to deliver results quarterly. So we're not giving it from a perspective of theory, we're giving it from a perspective of being just as accountable as they are.
You know, one of the things I liked about the book and thought was interesting about it, I was out in Silicon Valley shortly after I joined Fortune 5 years ago, and I was talking to, I won't give his name, but I was talking to a pretty prominent venture capitalist, and I said, well, what would you do if you were me? He said, I'd shut the magazine, get rid of the magazine. You don't want to do print, go all digital and get rid of the print magazine. You guys take a very different view, what you call the old, now new. Which of you wants to explain that?
Go on.
Yeah, I mean, let me start and then you jump in, Paul. I mean, the old model that says I've got a legacy business and I've got to exit is not as applicable as you might think. Because actually, the material profits, the profit stream in the business are coming from the core business. If you ditch the core business, you won't have enough fuel to invest in the future growth. It turns out one of the insights of this is that while management find it hard to predict and see disruption coming in the industry, so do investors. So investors are not much wiser at spotting which technological innovations will cause a disruption in a particular industry. It's actually one of our core theses here is actually you need to rethink how you invest. That's part of the story as well. But Paul, why don't you go?
Yeah, no,
So how does that work? How do you do all at the
Well, I
same
think
time?
it's the real question of how do you innovate in 3 different horizons? And that's one of the great questions. And I'll give you a couple of examples that hopefully make it a little bit more real. One of the ones that I liked is AB InBev, because it was about the mass market beer question. And that was a market.
Why would that be a particularly interesting decision?
I have invested. We'll find out in about 30 minutes. But because it's amazing, because if you like, everybody knows about microbrews now, and the challenge and the pressure that put on mass market beer. And why would you buy a mass market beer? And what happened is the microbrews used technology to make really affordable microbrews. So the mass market brewers were really up against it, but through active programs of zero-based budgeting and new technologies themselves to all sorts, Anheuser-Busch actually figured out how to lower the costs dramatically of creating mass market beer, and then also recognized, look, every beer is sort of mass market if you're going to make money on it. And so it started producing the microbrews for a number and buying a number of prominent microbrews and creating it en masse through the channel at the right price.
It wasn't an either or.
It was not an either or choice. It was the old, the now, and the new brought together.
So Larry, Paul, I'm going to let you guys go. Paul, you can go get a beer. It's right in the back.
Right, thank
and bring Ariana up on stage so we can continue to talk about that. Thank you both.